Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Consent Conversations. We are excited to have all of you joining us today. My name is Christine Self, Director for Family Outreach and Engagement with Parent and Family Relations. And joining me today are Dr. Kimberly Simone, Texas Tech's Title IX Coordinator, and Chad Chavez, Associate Director with the Office of Student Conduct. This webinar is part of our Parent and Family Relations webinar series, where we share important information on topics of interest to Red Raider families. We hope this webinar will provide you with insights on how to talk with your children of any age up until college about consent, an often challenging conversation to have. We plan to keep the webinar to about 30 minutes or so. If there's time at the end, we'll open it up for questions using the Zoom Q&A feature, but feel free to type your questions throughout the webinar. We do have some folks behind the scenes who can help answer those as we go. We are recording this session and posting it to our website so that you'll be able to review it again later or share with others. I will also email the recording link to the email that you used to register for the webinar. So at this point, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we're going to get into our discussion here. And so I have a number of questions that are going to kind of guide our conversations here, and we'll all offer our perspectives. So the very first question that we have before us is, why is it so important to have a conversation with your children about consent? And so anyone who wants to start can get us started.
I'll hop in. I'm really glad that you all are joining us today. This is a really important topic for me in my role at Texas Tech as the Title IX coordinator, but also because I'm a mom to two young kids. They have been having conversations about consent before they even actually knew what consent was. So this is a pretty big value in our house. But I think two reasons why it's so important to me to have these conversations, no matter how awkward. Number one, I really want to be their source of information. We live in a time where kids of all ages, unfortunately, can get a lot of information, and it's not always correct. It's not always aligned with what I might want them to know. And so the earlier we start talking about these things, the more likely they are to come to me with questions instead of the internet or somebody's older brother or sister. The other thing professionally that I see in my role, kids of any age that have had really open and honest dialogue with their parents are much more likely, in the event something has happened, that they will reach out to and include their parents in those discussions. One of the things that's really hard in our office when we see a student who has had maybe an unsafe relationship or an unwanted sexual encounter, if that's the first time I've ever talked to my parents about sex, I'm probably not doing it now. But kids that feel that that conversation is okay, is safe, they reach out to parents when they need them. And so both personally and professionally, really important in my role.
And I would echo exactly what Kimberly said. You know, it's such an important conversation to have. It's great if you started early, but it's never too late to have this conversation. So if you're a college student here at Texas Tech, if you're the parent of a college student, it is not too late to talk about it. You know, again, opening those lines of communication is so important because, you know, if your student has questions, again, you want them to come to you, and you know, if something happens, you want to be able to support them, and they're likely not going to discuss it with you if you haven't already started having these kinds of conversations. Anyone wants to add here? I'm going to jump right in then and talk about our next question, and that's what we're hearing from parents and family members. So in our office, Parent and Family Relations, we talk to a lot of families, and I talk to a lot of people who their students are struggling with some of these issues. And one of the things that we know, we've surveyed our current students' families, and we've asked them, what are some of the difficult conversations or challenging conversations to have with your students? The number one and number two topics that were the most challenging to have were about things like romantic relationships, as well as, you know, safer sex, and those kind of conversations. So those are the most challenging. We know that. So that's one of the reasons we wanted to put together this webinar, is to provide you with some talking points and some things to use in having those discussions, because we know they're challenging for you. Another thing that I would say that I hear from parents and family members is how they wish they knew more. I had a conversation with a parent of a student who wished that she had known more about consent in a romantic relationship. And so how it's important to have a discussion about consent with a partner that you're intimate with, because things can still happen that are not consensual. And the mom had never discussed that with her daughter. And then she found out much later that her daughter had been sexually assaulted by a current romantic partner, and how difficult and traumatic that was. And she just didn't know that she had the right to say no to activities because she was in a relationship with someone. And so there are things like that that families are just not aware of, that they need to talk about with their students. And so that's another reason that we wanted to put this together. And so with that kind of idea in mind, I think it's really important that families and their children, their students are kind of on the same page about what consent actually is. And so I wanted us to talk a little bit about the definition of consent and what it means. And so I'm going to show on my screen the definition of consent from the Texas Tech Code of Student Conduct. So I'm hoping everyone can see that. And so what are some ways that will help us understand when we're talking with our students and children about what consent really is?
I love that you added the piece about this applies whether it's a new relationship or an ongoing relationship, right? One of the things that when I'm talking with students, I like to talk about, I've been married for several years, we have kids together, right? But consent is still important in my relationship too. It's not just the first time that you're meeting someone. This should be an ongoing conversation. That's the word we like to use. Sometimes if it's really awkward to talk to people about it, we talk about like where you're going to go for dinner and how that's a back and forth discussion. Where would you like to go? Where would you like to go? Well, we had pizza last night, so maybe not pizza, maybe burgers sound good. I'm not feeling a burger, but what about this, right? It's the back and forth, the really getting to what specifics are good for people. Maybe I felt like pizza yesterday, but I don't feel like pizza today. That's okay. I think one of the best things we can do when we're talking to people about consent is this is a place where you don't have to be polite. You can be really clear about what you do and don't want, what is good for you and what's not good for you. We don't want anybody to have to guess, especially a partner, because we think they should know us better. We don't want people guessing if there's been any alcohol or drugs involved. So as clear as possible, the back and forth discussion, and for each new thing. So we agreed to pizza, but we haven't talked about if we're getting dessert after, right? There's no assumption that dessert's okay just because pizza was okay. Clear, forthcoming. If you aren't sure, ask. If you think that you may know what they want, but you're not sure, no matter how awkward it is, make sure you clarify.
I'm really glad that you brought up the example of, what do you want to eat today? Do you want pizza? So you can get to the restaurant, you can sit in the booth, you can order your food. It comes out, but you realize, what? I do not want this anymore. It's okay to stop what you're doing and say, this isn't for me. I do not want this. I am not okay with it. It's okay to change your mind and feel comfortable with that decision. But we also need to make it very, very clear that you are not okay. You do not want this anymore. We just can't assume, or we can't think we know what the other person is thinking. We have to make it very, very clear.
One point that, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think one of the saddest things I've ever heard in my role, and we kind of mentioned this earlier when we were talking about in relationships, we had a student that made a comment, I didn't want to be rude. I didn't know it was okay to say no, like I've been raised to be polite and to be considerate of other people's feelings. And I think really framing it as it's not rude or inconsiderate to know what is right for you and to put that out there. I think one of the things that we tell students all the time that would be really helpful if they're hearing from parents as well is anyone that's worth being in a romantic relationship with you, anyone that is worth you being sexually active with, they should absolutely respect your boundaries, what is good for you. And if they don't deserve to be in those relationships with you.
That's exactly what I was going to say. I think so many people are taught, especially, Texas Tech is in West Texas. We're in a region where politeness is very much valued. And I think, you make a really good point about how it's okay not to be polite when we're talking about our boundaries. That's essential here. And so, talking with your student, not only about how to get consent, but also how to give it, how to be able to stand up for your values and your boundaries in these conversations. And that kind of brings me to our next topic. I'm going to stop sharing my screen again, just to kind of give some examples of how you have talked to your children about consent at whatever age that they are. I know they're not college students just yet, but how have you had those conversations?
So I have a 5-year-old, and even before he could use his words, we started learning and teaching sign, like, what does this mean? Stop. Like, or do you want more? So having that physical way to say whether you want something or not, but also too, once we start being able to use our words, how can you clearly say that? So, as a 5-year-old, we just want to play. Everybody's playing all the time. So my 5-year-old, when we have splash day at school, just because you wear your bathing suit, just because you show up to school, doesn't mean you want to participate in the splash day. So I always tell everybody, or I tell him, how do you know when this person is okay with getting wet or getting splashed? Just because they wore a bathing suit, just because they're close to the water, doesn't mean it's okay. Do you ask them, is it okay? Can I get you wet? Can I splash you? And if they are showing signs that they do not like it, do you stop? Yes, we have to learn to, show me what that looks like. Show me how that they don't like it. Are they putting their hands up? Are they screaming? Are they crying? Well, then it's not okay anymore, and apologize. But I'm hoping that as a 5-year-old, we can continue to have these conversations as he gets older. So we, once we get to this higher ed level, we can have that clear conversation of how do we be respectful towards yourself and towards other people.
So starting when our kids were really little, my parents thought this was weird because we did not have any conversations about consent or sex at all, ever in my family. So that's probably why I've been so intentional with my kids. But we started at a really young age of, can I give you a hug goodnight? Would you like a kiss? Would you like to be tucked in? And if they said no, we didn't do that. I didn't love as a mom when my 3-year-old might be mad and he didn't want a goodnight hug, but starting at that really young age, you get to tell me, even mom, you even get to tell mom when you don't want to be touched, when you don't want to be hugged, when you'd rather high five or fist bump or whatever it is. And so then as we talk about some of those more complicated types of touch, that foundation was set pretty early on. And I think about, we had a time we were at home visiting family for Christmas, and my kids were playing with some other kids. There was a little girl, my son was maybe about 5 or 6, and the little girl was slightly older, maybe 8 or 9. And they were playing a tickling game, and my son was tickling her, and she said, stop. And her mom just very instinctively said, please, right? And so I stopped and said, we don't have to say please when it's rules about our body, right? Stop is a full sentence. And my son stopped immediately. And so I think for both of them to hear, we don't have to be polite, we don't have to ask twice, stop's a full sentence, because that's a thing we have already practiced so much, and that respect has been shown to him. It was second nature. He just quit right away. And I think as he's gotten older, we've had some more intensive conversations. We've had some more clear conversations. As we get older, we start using really real and appropriate language, right? So we don't use innuendos for body parts. We don't hint around what has happened. Because if something bad ever happens to our kid at any age, it's really important that they can clearly communicate what has happened to them. This person did X by touching me, Y, whatever that story is. And again, every time we model that as a parent, we are saying it's okay to be forthcoming. It's okay to be really honest. It's okay to have these vulnerable conversations. And just starting really simply, right? We didn't launch into the full sex talk the first time we talked. That would have been really awkward. But because that first conversation happened, he felt comfortable coming with a second question and with a third and a fourth. And so we use real words at our house. I answer questions when they're asked, and then we practice those boundaries, including from parent to child.
Awesome. Well, thinking about, again, talking to children at appropriate ages about this content, kind of segueing into, like, maybe you're on this webinar right now and you have a college student and you want to talk with them. So I'm going to share some kind of talking points on the screen, and then we can kind of go through these, and then if anyone has anything to add, certainly, but let me get these talking points on the screen. Again, this is not a conversation that's probably just going to pop up naturally. And so just having some ways to get the conversation started, I think, are important. So hopefully everyone can see these talking points on your screen right now. Some of the ways that you can start by having a conversation is just ask them, maybe you even start by saying, hey, I went to this webinar that Parent and Family Relations offered, and it was about consent. So what does consent mean to you? Or what does it mean for you? Thinking about, we also hear misconceptions about consent. So you might ask your student, what are some misconceptions about consent that you maybe have heard? Like a little bit earlier, we were talking about how it's always okay to change your mind. Maybe your student has heard that it's not okay to change their mind, and that's a way that you could have a conversation about that. Asking some kind of scenario-based questions might also be good. So, for example, what would you say if someone was pressuring you to do something that you didn't want to do? And that might not even be something to do with sexuality. It could be anything. It could be, what if someone was pressuring you to go to a party you didn't want to attend? Or what if someone was pressuring you to drink when you didn't want to? Those are some kind of good conversation starters that you might have with your student about a variety of topics. Another one, and this has to do with being a positive bystander in a situation, but you might ask your student, hey, what would you do that if you saw someone at a party who was intoxicated and in an unsafe situation? This might be a good jumping off point to talk about, Texas Tech has an amnesty policy. Just because your student might be drinking and they're worried about someone else who's drinking, if they report that, they're not going to get in trouble necessarily. So having some of those important conversations can be very helpful as well. And then a lot of times I've talked with family members who have used, things from the news or things they've seen in a television show or a movie as kind of, a jumping off point to talking about this conversation. So maybe there's a scene in a movie that, does not give a very good example of consent. You might ask, hey, did you see what just happened there? How could that have been better? How could that have been a better example of consent? So these are just some ways that you might jump off a conversation about consent with your college age student, or maybe even a little bit younger. And I wanted to see if Kimberly or Che had anything to add to kind of these types of conversation starters.
I love the bystander bullet because I think one of the things we see also when we're just giving really direct presentations to students, some of this is really overwhelming to think about yourself being in that situation, or for me thinking about talking to my own parents about sex and relationships. That might still be awkward, but we found that it's a lot easier for students to engage about how to be a good friend. What would I look for? How would I know this was dangerous? What are the things I would say on their behalf? And so especially if you're thinking, we've never had this conversation before, I don't know how to start this with my 19, 20-year-old kid, I have found that's a lot easier in. Right? If we had a friend we were concerned about, what would you do? Would you know where to go? Would you know how to help them? And then sometimes once you just open that door, then we can shift gears a little. But I think we have so many really excellent students at our university that I have been so impressed when we've worked with them in our office. They know these things. They have thought about these questions. They will say to a friend, here's what I want you to do. Here's how we need to get you some help. Let's get you connected. And so I think a lot of your students are thinking about this already, and they're eager to have this conversation. And it's just a nice in if maybe this is new for you.
Working in conduct, having those hard conversations is it happens all day, every day. And I have the talk with students, why did you start this? Why did you do this? And a lot of them were like, I really didn't know what to do at that point. And I'm like, okay, well, let's break down the situation. And as we go step by step by step, I handed this to them. I opened it. I put it to my mouth. Like I drank out of it. And I'm like, at all these points, you could have said no. At all these points, you could have changed your mind. You could have put it down, but we need to feel safe enough to and have the courage to speak up and say, hey, we're not okay with this. I don't want to start this. And it's in the moment, it's very, very difficult to figure out what would you have done differently. But as time passes, you can break down situations. It's like a football game. Everybody watches a game and everybody has an opinion of how it could have been done better. But when you put that situation out there, okay, let's break it down step by step. How could we have done things differently? And it's easier to bring up a situation that you're seeing from an outside point instead of a situation that you're actually in yourself. So try to look at different things from an outside perspective. When you see something happening, okay, let's break that down.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really good point. I think this kind of social pressure to do things, whether it's being polite, like we mentioned earlier, or, I don't want to be seen as someone who's not, this is an outdated term, but I'm a middle-aged woman that's not cool or not hip or something. How do we talk about that? Those are some things that you might want to consider too. It's completely fine not to always be polite when we're talking about our bodies. It's completely fine to say no to alcohol or drugs or situations that make you uncomfortable. And that's a really important, I think, thing to talk about with your students. All right. I wanted to share this too. And Kimberly, if you can talk about some of these resources that are offered by our Title IX office to help support students.
Yeah, so this QR code is something that your students have seen a lot. I hope many of them have downloaded it. If not, I would encourage you as the parent to download it and to ask your kids to download it as well. All it does is it saves this information into their phone contacts. So really non-invasive, it's just there if they need it. But what is in that contact is how to get in touch with our office, how to reach out to the RISE office, who does our prevention education, how they can contact our police department, our crisis helpline, the counseling center, the dean of students office. So it's really just a little information hub right there on their phone, because most times when students need this, it's like 2 o'clock in the morning. It's not, 10:15 on a Monday. And so it's right there on their phone, links to the website, links to our supportive measures and resources that we offer at the university. That may also be a good in for those conversations with your student, that the university does provide academic assistance, counseling assistance, that students have rights and options under our policy. All of that information is contained right here in this QR code. So if you're looking for another way to start that conversation, we mentioned, hey, I was at this webinar, I saw this QR code, have you already downloaded it, right? That might be a good way to start the conversation as well. It saves just under TTU Title IX, has all that information there when they need it, not in their way when they don't.
Awesome, thank you. All right, so we have a few minutes for questions. So if you have any questions that you would like our panel to answer for you, please use the Zoom Q&A feature to type your question in there, and we will try to get that answered for you. While you're thinking about your questions, I thought, and I'm putting them on the spot, I didn't tell them I was going to do this, but I thought I'd ask each of our experts here to, if there's anything that we did not talk about today that you would want to share. What's, maybe a last call to action or a last important point that you want our participants to know.
I just want to echo it's never too late to start the conversation. I think one of the things that can be surprising to a student is we haven't ever talked about this before, but something came up. I did decide to reach out to my parents, and they really came through for me. That's always a way that students are looking to connect. I think it's also really helpful for them to hear something that is not from their same age peer group, maybe a different perspective about how you think about things in your family or values that are important to you. Students that have that and carry it with them, it gives them kind of a buffering effect. It helps them to be good bystanders. It helps them, like Che mentioned, to evaluate a little better in the moment, like, is this in line with my values or is it not? Because I think one of the other things that's really hard to hear in my job after something bad has already happened, we have students that will say, well, I never even thought about this before. I didn't know if it was okay with me or not until it already happened. And so no matter how awkward it is, it's really helping to give your students the gift of what is okay for me. If I can talk to my parents about this, I can certainly talk to a romantic partner about this. I have a colleague that's teaching a first year class, and the students told her, well, we can't even say the word sex. Like, that's too awkward. They're having sex, but they can't say the word sex, right? And so just really kind of helping to make that less awkward, more discussion, more open. It is never too late to get that started. And I think your kids are more eager for it than you might realize.
So I didn't get the conversation whenever I was younger. That was something that we didn't have at our house. Things would have been a whole lot different had I had this conversation. So the one thing that I tell every student or every parent, every student, like, it's never too late to have that conversation. There's no right way, there's no wrong way, just have it. However you need to jump into it, however you can have the conversation, just have it. They'll thank you for it later, I promise.
Yes, and one of the questions that came up in our Q&A, I think you kind of just answered. The question was how to start a conversation about sexuality with a 16-year-old daughter. And again, I think it's just important to just have it. It's going to seem awkward, but again, your children want to hear it from you. They may not act like they do. But again, as Kimberly has mentioned, as everyone has mentioned here today, you get the opportunity to instill your values to that conversation if you have it. Otherwise, they're going to get this information whether you have the conversation or not.
And you can totally lean into it being awkward. I think that's fine. I think for a 16-year-old, if this is the first time, I think you can absolutely say, yeah, okay, this is going to be really awkward, but I want to make sure you know that we can talk about these things. I want you to feel comfortable talking to me, even if this feels really uncomfortable and strange right now. We'll practice till we get it right. What questions do you have? What would you like to know? What can we find out together? Because just giving that open invitation, a student knowing that they could come to you if they want to, I say lean into the awkward, right? Like, you're 16. I realize that you are growing up, and I want to make sure you have what you need from me. And if there's anything that you want to know, if there's anything we can figure out together, like, I'm right here.
So they might not be ready for the conversation right now at that moment, but by you at least attempting, it's planting that seed. Once they start to have that moment where they put their phone down, or they're not actually doing something that's just taking up time, they're like, well, okay, they tried to have that conversation with me. I wasn't ready at that exact moment, but the more that I think about it, you know what, maybe I'm ready now. How do we talk about it now? Like, hey, you brought this up with me at some point. Can we talk now? So everything starts with small and in a little bit of effort. If we just put a little bit into it, it will develop over time.
And maybe look for the not so obvious invitations they're giving you, right? Because my kid is not going to come up to me and say, I'd like to have a serious conversation with you. My kid says something like, can we go for a walk? And then ambushes me with the questions on the walk, or can we drive somewhere together, just us? And so they may not say like, hey, Dad, I'm ready to have that conversation. Can we sit down? But it might be, can we go do this thing over here? Because sometimes if you're doing something different, it's less awkward than like if you're sitting at the table looking at each other. So just being open to those invitations and opportunities.
That's a really good point. And we are at just barely after 12:30, so we are out of time. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and stop the recording. If you still have questions, type them in. We'll stay on for a couple minutes just to see. Our contact information is on the screen for you. And know that we will follow up this afternoon with a link to the recording. And we'll also upload it on our website for you, and then be watching for additional webinar opportunities throughout the semester. I want to thank our panelists, and thank you for joining us today, and thank you for being here. Again, this is an important conversation. So reach out to us with any questions that you may have, or let us know how it's going. Thanks, y'all.